This is a joint, it's a collaboration between two organisations, between TAPDEN, which is the Theatre and Performance Design Education Network. This was a network that was founded 3 years ago and had an inaugural event at the Barbican and Wimbledon College of Art, and was really formed in order to throw the net open to the sort of international performance educators and start a conversation going and using platforms to discuss the teaching of the subject area. And this is jointly run then with PDEC, which is the Performance Design Educators Collective. And this is an umbrella organisation of courses at universities and colleges across the UK, which again seeks to be there as a forum for discussing our subject and the pedagogy of performance design. So this has come together, and it's thanks to the support of Wimbledon College of Art and the University of the Arts London that this has been possible, and Jane represents from there, and we also have Andreas as one of the conveners from the Royal School of Speech and Drama, and we also have Peter, who's also associated at Wimbledon College of Art, and also crosses over between the two organisations. So without kind of further ado, and without holding, I'm going to introduce today's panel, today's session. And today we have called this one Relocating Learning and New Discoveries, which is actually seems to be a theme that has been coming up a lot. And we have two fantastic speakers who've just come on now, which we've got Tessa Rixon joining us from Queensland in Australia, and we have Olayinka Smart Babalola joining us from Ibadan in Nigeria. We'll be starting with Tessa's presentation. Tessa is a practitioner researcher in intermedial performance, digital scenography, and Australian design. As lecturer in scenography at Queensland University of Technology, Tessa's work promotes new modes of integrating established and emergent technologies, explores the symbiosis of interactive media and embodied performance practice, and showcases Australian scenographic practice and histories.
My name is Tessa Rixon, lecturer in scenography here at the Queensland University of Technology in Brisbane, Australia. And today I'm going to share with you some of the new discoveries that came out in our performance design training in 2020 and the legacy that's had on our undergraduate performance and production training to date, and share with you one particular model that we designed in the first half of last year when we were in lockdown during COVID, and then how we sort of adapted through the rest of the year and even coming into 2021, and sort of reflect on how it's been for us here. So just acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that I am on today here in Brisbane, to the Yagara and Turrbal people, and acknowledge that these have always been places of teaching, learning and research. And particularly this week, which is NAIDOC week here in Australia, just pay respect to the traditional owners of these lands and the elders past, present and emerging, and the incredible contribution that our Indigenous population has, not only to our arts and education, but our entire country. So this is some context. So the scenography minor that I run is based within the Bachelor of Fine Arts Technical Production course at QUT, and our students focus on design management and technology. So rather than specialising at an undergrad level, they learn all three. So in terms of our COVID impact, particularly in Queensland, so for the first half of 2020 from March, we were basically in state mandated lockdown with our theatre industry shut down and our universities closed. And then from the second half of the year, we sort of returned to a hybrid face-to-face studio teaching, but most of our performances had to be delivered online or with reduced audiences. And then from January to now, we're predominantly face-to-face. but we are frequently interrupted by snap lockdowns. We just actually emerged from one recently that's sort of happening all across the country at the moment. So the first project that really emerged during this time was what we called the Virtual Theatre Production Project. And that rolled out from March to May last year. That's kind of what I'm going to start with you, sharing with you at first, because it's sort of the major first challenge for us. So this came about, and there's quite a detailed process here. We wrote a journal article about this that you can see the link for below. But basically, when we went into lockdown, we had our second and third year cohort doing, usual traditional dance and theatre projects that had to then shift to be online supported and delivered as well. So the one major thing that happened, as well as, of course, losing access to our space and a lot of our technology and resources, were the disciplines that we usually collaborate with to perform, so dance, drama, music, and acting, separated and did their own separate projects. So we had no live performers to work with in this instance. And so our students had to find ways of staying true to the original assessment item and the learning outcomes so that it was a legitimate piece of assessment for them in remote online teaching, virtual delivery with no performers as well. So we had some resources to work with. We had some cloud-based software we were able to get licenses for, but we had a very little additional budget or support from our institution to sort of roll this out. So it was really myself and my two other colleagues here sort of making this project work. So we sort of cherry-picked a little bit from existing way that we run our design and rehearsal processes, and then created a framework based around some real structures. So we assigned them a real space, a real budget, and a real timeline for them to work within, and then sort of developed and hashed out the details of the assessment from there. But you can have a look at that in detail in that article. So in terms of the space we put them into, we wanted it to be as realistic as possible. So we created a virtual model of the Proscenium Arch Theatre here at QUT, which is also Gardens Theatre. So this meant the students had some embodied experience of this space when they were trying to create a virtual scenographic solution to it, which we found was really important. But that was a huge project in and of itself, where I drafted this venue, I think, over 3 days in a weekend in March. And here's a short video of that. So the virtual theatre productions basically boiled down to, we had 5 teams, combinations of our second and third year students together. 3 were curated by industry professionals and 2 curated by our own third year students. So curated rather than directed by, we wanted to really push for a sense of autonomy from each student and ownership over their process, and not sort of work more with a flat sort of non-hierarchical structure, which is quite different to our normal theatre processes. So we assigned a mixture of old and new texts, from Shakespeare to contemporary Australian works, and everyone had a role, either management or design role. They had to have rehearsals, production meetings, mental sessions, all virtually, all online throughout this process, supported by ourselves, but also industry mentors we were able to bring on board. And the final outcome, rather than being a virtual performance, for this instance was a fully realized, fully visualized design that was presented in hour-long design presentations, where they had to have costed, planned, visualized every single aspect of the performance and present that as if they were about to walk into the venue that following day and make this happen. So we imposed a few things. The students were free to choose whatever software program they wanted to both create and present as well. The presentation format was left relatively open, so they had some autonomy there, and we didn't stop them from spending too much time on it, which in retrospect we probably could have. And so this is a short video of the outcome of that virtual theatre production project. Now, as you saw a bit of a hint there, not all of our students worked purely digitally. We have a lot of students who prefer the tactile analog approach to design, particularly with our costume and props designers. So I made this short behind the scenes video for our institutional social media of one of our costume designers, Michelle, sort of sharing how she turned her living room during lockdown into a fashion workshop.
Hi there, my name's Michelle Hare and I'm the costume designer for Romeo and Juliet. I was really drawn to the timeless themes within the play, and so my inspiration came from modern day op-shop fashion. To reflect this timelessness, I designed costumes that are an eclectic mishmash of styles from the Renaissance to now. Juliet's wedding dress was inspired by 1970s bridal gowns, with a long gathered skirt, high neck, and fun puffy sleeves. Purple became a key symbol within the show's palette, and the beautiful lavender lace symbolises her soft and feminine side. This dress contrasts her other costumes, which represent her as a strong, outgoing woman.
When we were reflecting on the process, there were several, of course, successes that came out of it, but of course challenges as well. Now, there's a lot more detail on that in that article that we've written. To save time, I won't go into it too much. But successes, one thing that really came out of it was a newfound appreciation, engagement with text. Because students were spending so much time from a scenographic perspective analysing and breaking down the text they were given, as compared to focusing predominantly on actors and bodies and space, which of course is essential. But in this instance, it was a different and a process that led to a really rich engagement with the text that we hadn't really seen quite to that level before. So finding ways to maintain that into the future was really important. And also some of the play and experimentation that came out of this was amazing. They showed us things that we had not taught them and that they had just discovered for themselves. And then those other things there, but focusing more on the successes for this and sort of how that carried through into other projects. This was the model that we designed, sort of the pedagogical model coming out of it, which is captured in that journal article. So skipping more to the fun things though, however, there were other performance projects happening either concurrently to the virtual theatre production project or after in the second half of the year. So happening at the same time was what we call the Production Arts Project. Now, traditionally, this is a project by our second year students where they create a short performance with no performers on stage, but they use lighting, sound, costume, some puppetry, projection, etc. to tell a story that they themselves devise, usually in response to a theme or a social issue, whatever it might be. So this was a virtual process that had to have a performance outcome. And so the students really adapted to this in so many different ways. They live streamed performances through Twitch. They made use of Zoom. In this instance, this group actually worked with SketchUp, a program called Spark Online to create these virtual spaces that you could navigate through as the audience member. So it was more of a, create your own adventure performance in a virtual space, and you constructed bits of this narrative from these spaces they had designed rather than sort of being presented with a performance. And then another group here adapted from, I think it's Jeff Vandermeer's Annihilation text that created this model in a spare living room they had in one of their houses with working pyrotechnics, lighting. They storyboarded the work. There was puppetry as well. And then to present, they did it via Zoom, and they used the live feed camera to sort of guide their audience through this work. And that's a screenshot there. And then an image of the student calling that performance. So calling lighting cues, camera cues, etc. And then in the second half of the year, when we moved back into face-to-face delivery in the studio, we weren't allowed any audiences. And so we had to do studio-based performance, but then live stream that. And that had some really interesting impacts for our intermediate theatre project, which brings together our production and design students, as well as drama, dance, music students, etc., to create an intermediate work. And so this became, what was usually a sort of promenade performance with audiences. It became this response to looking through glass, the text, that was designed to be captured by the lens of the camera, but would combine, mediated performance, puppet performance, pre-recorded media, etc. And there's one of our camera operators there, and then curated through this Twitch stream that had multiple different camera angles combined with a live comment thread as well that you could actually comment to as an audience member, but they would actually have plants as well in there that would sort of drive the narrative. Very unstructured, very non-linear sort of narrative in this work, and they have quizzes, etc., to get everyone involved. But in terms of, from a design perspective, I think this is a really fascinating case examples of the legacy of this COVID impact. You can see with this floor plan here, the design and curation of this space being geared towards the lens of the camera rather than the audience themselves, being able to move from station A, B, C, D, back to B, back to C, back to A, and guide the audience through the lens of the camera, so the mise-en-scène rather than the embodied scenographic environment in this instance. And we had other projects as well, but that's just kind of two examples of kind of the legacy of how that sort of purely virtual and then moving back into hybrid form sort of impacted our students' approach to scenography and to design. Now, some sort of key takeaways, some benefits. We had some opportunities to play with virtual visualization that we hadn't previously before in the course. Also had to experiment with new ways of training for virtual spaces, focusing on mindfulness of domestic space and how that might apply to the virtual space in these settings. And actually we're still continuing to do these projects, even though we're predominantly face-to-face. So the virtual theatre production project still ran this year, and it was presented live rather than over Zoom. But we're finding the skills that came out of that were still really relevant for our students. So that's just a really brief look at sort of how it went for us here at QUT and the ongoing, positives that came out of the impact of COVID. It's been an exhausting process for staff, dealing with a lot of institutional change as well. But I'm happy to take a moment to reflect on the positives that emerge from it. Now, of course, if you want to know more, you can give me a contact here. I'd love to hear from you, or check out that article as well that we've written. Okay, thanks so much for your time, everyone.
Thank you, Tessa, for that fantastic presentation. An enormous amount for us to digest in that one, and that's going to bring up a lot of discussion, I think. And we're now going to go over to Olayinka Smart Babalola from University of Ibadan in Nigeria. Olayinka is a theatre artist, scholar and entrepreneur with over 30 years experience as a stage and screen director, actor and producer. Olayinka is a theatre festival organizer who founded Ibadan Festival of Theatre International, and an arts fellow at the University of Ibadan where he teaches directing, acting and media arts.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Olayinka Smart Babalola. I teach acting and directing at the University of Ibadan, Nigeria. I'm presenting a paper on relocating learning delivery in acting and directing from the traditional performance space onto cyberspace during the COVID-19 lockdown in Nigeria. Thank you. All acting and directing practical sessions are theatrical performances. because the director serves as the surrogate audience. Traditionally, a theatrical performance is a peculiar kind of interaction between performers and observers in a shared physical space. We also know that in theatre arts training, acting and directing are core practical courses. That is, the classes would have to have some sort of interaction among students, and then between students and their facilitators or lecturers or coaches. And of course, they would have to share in a physical space. Therefore, the classrooms are usually designed for performances. In Ibadan, we have the Wale Soyinka Theatre, and we also have the Jeffrey Axworthy Studio. From practical acting to directing sessions, through rehearsals, through performances, the spaces were specifically designed to accommodate all this kind of interactions. However, the COVID-19 pandemic necessitated a total lockdown of the universities, whereby all students are to observe social distancing, so they cannot, gather in the same space for any form of physical interaction. Now, this particular lockdown posed a serious threat to acting and directing training delivery in Ibadan. This study also examines the practicality of online learning and the breaking of the spatial barriers between the physical acting and directing classrooms and the digital learning workshop. The study interrogates as well the skills that are needed by actors and directors during the training to perform within a changing spatial environment, such as cyberspace, and the adequacy of the available teaching materials and methods. The interfacing nature of the theatre and the internet allows for hyper-textuality of the actor's body in relation to digital tools and methods such as text, avatars, and holograms. The process of learning is parallel to a pivotal shift in the performance and performance space vis-a-vis digital performance. The antecedent influence of Peter Brook's theory of the empty space, 1968, and Richard Schechner's theories of environmental theatre, 1973, and the performance studies, 2002, have greatly influenced the treatment of space in postmodern theatre practices. And with David Benyon's 2014 typology of space, they all form the theoretical background to this study. The mostly germane to this study is the relationship between physical and digital space. Although the transition from traditional performance spaces to home space seemed difficult, technology presented a way out for performing artists, and digital performance is now an essential mode for performing artists. In our department, the training for acting and directing were not easy to move online, but we were able to transmute online, and we were using a combination of Zoom, Google Classroom, Telegram, and WhatsApp to deliver training and to provide artistic, psychological, and emotional support to our students. When the closure of universities mandated online learning, it was a general assumption that there should be no problem from the students' angle because they're already used to, networking online anyway. Therefore, we readily deployed Google Classroom and Zoom as our preferred method of synchronous training. Because these two supports video conferencing on a large scale, and they are quite easy to use. However, most students of public universities are not economically buoyant, unlike their counterparts in private universities. So it was not easy to migrate online, in public universities as it was in the private universities. So both the institutions and the students complained of the prohibitive cost of online learning, of streaming bitrates of videos and graphics in the electronic remote training that University of Ibadan was deploying. Therefore, Unibadan's ERT and LMS efforts did not work as expected, because many of the staff found it very cumbersome to adapt to, and of course the technology from the university's end was also not too easy to follow. It was quite difficult as well. In the Department of Theatre Arts, we had to adapt to those platforms that the students were used to, such as WhatsApp, Telegram, and Facebook, in order to deliver training, especially in acting and directing. We had to create the online space where we can meet and interact. After our migration of acting and directing courses, we discovered during the synchronous classes on Telegram that some students are unable to join the class. They were perpetually absent. And this was due to either poor network connection in their areas, lack of data, or the unconducive physical environment at home where they were joining. Or at worst, they didn't have the device that they can use to join the internet. Also, we had to combat the problem of the students having to be in two spaces at the same time. That is their physical environment of home space and the digital space. Now, for the classroom task and the concentration of students, it was very difficult. There were many students who were doing other things when they were supposed to be in class. And of course, the facilitators and the lecturers struggle with how to control this duality of presence. The solution was to move from synchronous into asynchronous classes. And it is believed that, okay, if we had asynchronous training, many of the students will be able to learn in their own free time rather than be there at the time as in synchronous learning delivery. Now, the asynchronous learning that we adopted seemed cheaper and easier because it was mainly done with texts and audio recordings. Now, group leaders of the different groups will lead the other students in workshops and send audio recordings of what they're supposed to be doing, and then the students will respond either through text or another audio recording, because we discovered that even in our synchronous classrooms, to download video was too heavy. Was too much on their data. So they couldn't even download videos. So it was a very tough call. So we had to rely on audio recordings and texts, chatting for the asynchronous class to work well. We had to retain Zoom as a means of our practical presentations, where once a week everybody can get on Zoom and they can present their monologues and their improvisations with everybody present and we can give feedbacks. Unfortunately, during performances on Zoom, technical glitches like loss of audio, echoes during calls, inability to sign in, Zoom crashes, screen freeze, amidst other problems disrupted the flow of action. Now, these problems contributed to the larger problem of interactivity because it was not easy for students who are unable to log on to Zoom or to even get access, or during the performances their screen froze up. Even the performance screen might freeze up. So the whole idea of interacting between the members of the groups became very difficult, and interactivity is quite germane to to the training of acting and directing. Furthermore, critiquing, which is a very important aspect of actor-director training, suffered latency during this online classes because many of the feedbacks or critiques have to be sent in after the performances. So there was no immediacy in the responses. That is even where a student has been able to see and be able to do informed critique of the action. But most of the time, they had to send in this critique through text or through audio recordings, which will be long after the performance. Maybe another person will be performing before that one will come in and all that. This greatly reduced the potential for peer-to-peer feedback and discussion. In conclusion, online space and online mode of learning delivery have proved to barely support coaching students in acting and directing. For instance, our monologues and improvisations and the directing workshops, which thrive on audience participation, the performance spaces on Zoom and Telegram reduced or outrightly took out the spontaneity of the performance. Now, our students have accessibility problems, poor internet service, high data cost. Many students lack access to digital devices that they need to use to get on the internet. Therefore, they receive less learning and support online. Most importantly, embodied enactment and instinctive exchange central to performing arts is lost in cyberspace. Either performing in space or watching a performance, those who share the space are not just in space. Their interrelationship shapes the shared space. The future of digital performance promises a very deep collaboration with cutting-edge technology. Training in performative arts cannot be otherwise. For instance, Microsoft has developed HoloLens, that's 2016, and David Nussbaum's Portal, 2019, are pioneering holoportation together. Now, this is a state-of-art hologram technology which will improve our notion of digital space and interactivity. This technology will demand an understanding of the spatial topology of digital performance for the actor and the director. Hence, it is imperative to include digital methods and digital interactivity early in the training of actors and directors. The challenge, however, is how developing countries like Nigeria, how will they get onto the 5G technology and domesticate it? For this is definitely the future of performance or cyberperformance. Finally, the coming of COVID-19 has revolutionized tertiary learning. And the Nigerian educational system must rise up and meet with the challenges of emerging alternative spaces and locations of learning. Thank you.
Olayinka, also for that presentation, fantastic, and I think very important to actually bring the performers back into the discussion. We've been talking a lot on the discussions yesterday, focused a lot around the nature of scenography. It's actually, I think, refreshing to bring the performer back in. And thank you for joining us on the panel. And perhaps that's a good place to start, in fact, because I was struck by both the contrast between the two presentations that we've just seen. You know, we put these together partly in order to highlight those differences, but also to look at the similar issues that we're all dealing with in terms of relocating the learning. But if we could start there, because I was struck kind of, Tessa, in a way, you actually removed the performers were removed from the equation effectively, weren't they? As courses tended to retreat back to their own little silos and deal with the pandemic on a course by course nature, and very much that was experience that we had too in my institution. And then Olayinka, in a way, you were kind of left. You have just the performer, as it were, and how that, you know, we might go on to discuss how that kind of then connects to aspects of the scenography around that and the design implications. I can see there's already a question there looking at the implications of this on the design aspects. But I wonder if you could perhaps just open up a little bit more, discuss a little bit about that. Do you feel that there has been perhaps a more separation of the disciplines? I mean, we talk a lot, and we talked a lot yesterday about collaboration, about new collaborations. We talked about roles breaking down so that people were actually all in it together, and it was hard to define different roles. But it struck me in your two presentations that there's also been a certain amount of narrowing of disciplines or separation of disciplines. Perhaps you could just address that. Tessa, if we go to you first.
Yeah, thanks, Will. That's a really great question. Yes, it was an unfortunate byproduct of kind of the mad dash last year for all of the areas to kind of find a solution. And, you know, in the first, you know, it felt like weeks, but it was probably only 24 hours where we were talking about how we cope with this. And everyone just kind of, you know, by everyone I'm talking about our dance, drama, music, visual art sort of disciplines. They were like, we can't handle the collaboration aspect right now. We need to focus inward, and silo definitely was the word that we were using, which was really, it made a lot of things possible because we were just able to just hunker down in our team and make decisions and do what we needed to do. But we really lost a focus on the real body. Like the body in these became either, you know, the standard body that shows up in ETC's Augment 3D program, or like a virtual animated body in SketchUp, or a sort of, you know, a slightly idealized body in a costume render. And so very flat, very 2D, even though of course some of them are 3D visualizations, so they were lacking that, you know, that liveness, to use that wonderful word. And it definitely was kind of tied in with the challenge of we lost that real body, and we lost a real connection to space as well. So I was doing throughout this some mindfulness and meditation exercises with my students, trying to get them to be conscious of their domestic space and get them thinking about their body's connection to their domestic space, and how that might unlock something or be a starting point to then access a connection to a virtual space. And I got no data on how well that worked, but it was an interesting approach. So yes, but it is actually something, unfortunately, we're still having to deal with, because we've had a lot of changes in our institution and a lot of budget cuts. And so our ability to do shows has decreased. And so we're still finding we are still more siloed than we ever have been before as an impact of what happened with COVID. So yes, but that's me talking long enough. I'll throw over to
thank you.
there.
Thanks, Tessa. Excellent. And again, it addresses that issue of designers, of scenographers putting themselves in a performer's point of view, albeit in a domestic situation, and trying to visualize themselves in that way. Olinka, if I could just sort of ask you to address the same question about the separation or not of disciplines.
The separation of between design and performance in our own peculiar condition in Nigeria. We've always had to work together, but moving onto the digital space, onto technology and all that, it has been a major issue for naturally being a developing economy. It's quite, not that we don't have the digital technology and all that, but it's quite expensive to deploy most of the time. So it's, I mean, I see some of the presentation here, I'm like, wowed. The reason why am I wowed? Our students will not be able to do some of these things on their own, in their own spaces, because they will need the right equipment, they need the right software, they will have to work, with a lot of money, basically. But it is not, I mean, it's taken for granted in the West that we have these things in the West. But here, it is not available. I mean, it's not for granted. So the little that we are able to do with technology is actually mainly social media. And when you're talking about social media, okay, how do we also use this social media to make sure that we do something? So when we want to talk to designers, they finish their design and they send it to us via, via email or whatever, and then we look at it. If we agree with it as directors, we let them know. If you don't agree, we let them know. They, they rework, and it's quite difficult actually working like that. I mean, imagine if you are working together in the same room and you bring your design, you can work on it, at a time. But as it is now, you have to wait for somebody to finish a design and then interpret the way he thinks he heard you, and then brings it back, and it might not be what you want and all that. But actually, the major problem is the breaking the digital divide. That is we have that now.
Yeah. That was quite striking, wasn't it? In the contrast again between the presentations, you're talking about the issues around access to digital, whether it's the hardware, the software, the actual internet access, and then we see images too in Tessa's presentation with running thing. I think it was one with 3 laptops going simultaneously and a mobile at the same time, and it's very interesting contrast on how we. How you solve issues in those different ways. I don't know if anybody else wants to sort of jump in on this one. Jane.
Thank you both for 2 really fascinating presentations, and Olinka particularly for being so honest about what's happening. I mean, I think we all have to agree actually that we have had absences with students. Not everybody's been there all the time. It has been hard work. So I think you've put that on the table and found, ways of, I don't think it's all been, blowing whistles and it's all been brilliant. We've all had to face that, and issues of students having to have other jobs and keep going in these circumstances. So I appreciate that you've put that on the table. I just want to make a point first, not so much questions as a point, something Tessa said, which I think relates to what Olinka was saying, which I thought was really interesting. You used the word, I think there's a project called Intermedial, the Intermedial project. And I suddenly thought, this is a much better word to be using than collaboration, because if you see the actor's body as another medium, you start to think in terms of intermedial, and that the actor then is one of the mediums through which stories are being told or work is being made. It kind of has more of an equality to it than collaboration, which can still just fall back onto the old hierarchies, which, put the director, the actor, the designer somewhere in the background. it kind of struck me as being something that, I know there's a lot written about intermediality, but I don't think it kind of puts the actor as a medium in the same way. I don't know, maybe it does and I just haven't read about it, but it seemed to me that was really useful. And just briefly, Olayinka, I've worked at your university over 30 years ago. I don't think, but I do know Ibadan very, you know, I remember Ibadan very well and very fondly. And I think what you were talking about for actors in Nigeria, to have that direct interaction with the audience taken away must be quite devastating, because so much of the performance, as I remember it, has a kind of improvisationary, direct address to the audience and interactivity that you talked about, and almost, and quite often a kind of kinetic scenery, so that the space is costumed, it's kind of quite, you know, it's not necessarily a fixed set.
Yes.
So to have that movement, that kind of taken away, must be doubly frustrating, I would have thought, for many of your performers and designers. I just wanted to make that point.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yes, I was struck by this too, because you talked a few times in, you know, in your presentation about the theatre as an interaction between the performer and the audience, and you're taking away half of a conversation in a way, aren't you? And it goes back to that nature of that all these discussions are throwing up in terms of, you know, what is theatre, coming back to that basic idea, and as James pointing out, particularly, you know, that a theatre that thrives on audience participation and spontaneity that you talked about in your presentation. Yes, that's a really good point. I just want to also just to move on to, you were discussing, you know, the technologies that you did find through Facebook and all other ways of kind of creating meeting spaces, the online spaces that we had to kind of create. And you know, I think that highlighted to the importance of to the idea of the studios, the acting spaces or the design studios, as places which are a sort of leveling, I don't want to use the word a neutral space, but a kind of a leveling space where everybody's there on the same terms in a way. As soon as we take people out and put them back in their domestic environments, there's all sorts of other things impact on that, whether it is down to sort of the digital deprivation, or whether it's just the home situation around that. And I wonder if you could just sort of perhaps just talk about how, you know, the importance and how you've kind of created online spaces that actually go some way to mitigate against the loss of that kind of shared space. Perhaps again, if we go to you, Tessa, first on that.
Yeah, sure. I excuse me. Let me think about that. I think one of the things for us that was really hard in the beginning, and we got a little better with it as time went on, was developing more of an empathy. Oh, that sounds really cold-hearted, but developing more of an empathy for our students, and because the situation was developing, so what they were going through was still developing, but we realized we needed to have a great level of empathy as educators for what they would do. And like this idea that, oh, everyone's out of work, but actually a lot of our students working in supermarkets or fast food or food delivery or, you know, Uber Eats, you know, those sorts of things, they were actually working well and above what they would normally. And so this kind of perception that everything had stopped and all they had was their classes was, you know, very short-sighted of us for a couple of weeks there. And we realized they were trying to balance these things, but also balance some changes that were happening in their families. Like we had students whose parents lost jobs, you know, just before they came into a virtual class. And so it was, we tried very hard to develop an educator empathy through it. One thing that we did, and this probably sounds really small, I think, given the context, but just allowed them to turn their cameras off, turn their microphones off. If they wanted to contribute to a class or a conversation, we gave them the chat, or used a Facebook page or like an online whiteboard sort of program. I think Mirror is the name of it. So tried to find a few different ways that they could be engaged rather than what initially we saw as engagement, which is this, you know, straight to the camera, looking at us the entire time. We recognized that that was just a fake engagement from them. And so, yeah, they could have their cameras off. They could do whatever they needed to do in that instance. But I honestly, like we didn't do that great in terms of managing their time on Zoom and helping to support them in that first project, because they did so much, and we could have definitely helped to prevent some Zoom fatigue and putting harsh, stricter like restrictions around, you know, or there's some guidelines around what we expected from them in terms of that time. Like, they were all exhausted because they had classes going on as well as all these projects, and so I think we didn't do great with it in the first instance, and got a little bit better as time went on. So yeah.
And also for yourself as an educator, I mean, the Zoom fatigue was quite extreme, probably, you know, in the initial, certainly.
Yeah.
Yeah,
thank you very much. And Yinka, can I just ask you, you know, to on the same
yes.
topic?
Thank you, Will. With our situation, we try to meet our students at the points of their needs, really. It's very important that we deliver training, and it's very important that they, you know, partake in the training. So whichever way they were going to reach them was what we went out for. I realized at the very beginning that it would be easy for the students to interact online because they usually do that. But when it comes to formal training, it became something else in the sense of, you know, dual presence in the digital space. So you are present online and you're also present in your own house, maybe doing something totally different. And then you have to also respond to group activity. So that was a bit of a tricky one to manage, but we're able to do that. But I realized though that audio, I never thought that much before. I realized during the online training that audio is a very important aspect of our training. So we relied a lot on audio recordings and feedbacks, and it worked well for us. Even though it might not be the very best because we are prepared audiovisual, but with audio, it allowed us to stay in that space without much of a hassle. But when it comes to video, it became very big, and you know, for them to download. Even if you are doing a simple exercise, I say, okay, show us what the exercise you are doing so others can follow. And you realize that somebody taking that video, the others might not be able to download it to see it. So, but we just have to manage between Facebook, Telegram especially, and of course WhatsApp, to manage our classes. And at the end of the day, it worked well. And I'm even afraid now that we might even be going back to that because there's lockdown going all over now. So we might also be locking down and going back to the online training. But at least we've started, and we can only improve on what we've already started doing. You understand?
Yes, I think Jane, thank you, Olinka. I think Jane wanted to comment there.
Actually, I was just going to say there's a very good comment in the Q&A from John Crows, who interestingly is an audio artist. I know, works in sound, but he's talking about training for outdoor spaces. He may like to speak. So.
Yes, I was going to say the other thing too, just to all attendees, if you do wish to speak, there's an option to raise your hand at the bottom bar along to the Q&A. So if you'd rather just raise your hand to ask a question, do by all means do that. But John, if you're there, we can turn your mic on if you'd like to ask your question live. That would be fantastic.
Yeah, hi, can you hear me?
We can.
Yeah, I mean, I'm an outdoor theatre practitioner, and so one of the things I've noticed is my colleagues in the outdoor arts sector really starting to see the opportunity that COVID has created for people to re-engage with some very kind of old traditional kind of material practices of scenographic sort of design for outdoor spaces on seafronts and promenades and in woods and forests, and so yeah, that was the sort of the origin of my question really, but also because we do kind of feel this digital imperative, don't we? We've kind of you know, we've reached for them in a way. COVID has made us reach for the most obvious kind of way of getting around the problem, which is to go online. And so then we engage with those problems of the, you know, the digital versus the material and the interaction of the audience and so on. So that was kind of the origin of my question, really, was about those kind of the way that whether or not you as practitioners feel that there's an opportunity to re-engage students with some kind of, you know, quite ancient practices, really, in some ways, of outdoor theatre and in public squares and gardens, where we can maintain that kind of interaction with people.
Thank you, yes, Tessa. Thank you. As a digital expert, let's go to you.
No. I thank you, John. That's a really great question. Let me get my thoughts together now. So it's gotten to the point of the evening here in Australia where I've started to I'm getting ready for bed. A challenge for me in this space is coming from, you know, my personal practices, looking at digital scenography, you know, new media, multimedia technology, whatever you want to call it, in performance, and going through this whole experience as well has I'm starting to look at the ethical ramifications of all the use of technology in performance, and kind of trying to, you know, help to query the idea of technology kind of as savior or as solution from an ecologically conscious perspective, like from an eco-scenographic perspective as well. And so while we've been doing all of these things with all these virtualization programs, I feel like I've done a complete 180 this year, where I'm starting to talk to my students about ecological design practice and the leave no trace principles that you'll come across if you ever go hiking anywhere, and trying to you know, connect more to country, which, you know, it's a very important component for our, you know, very, very varied, very diverse First Nations people here in Australia. And so trying to sort of borrow from their approaches in that sense. I'm trying to find an end to this point that I'm making. I think it's a really good point that you bring up. And also, like, I think personally, maybe even as an educator, having gone through that, you just kind of want to, I'm sick of the screen. I'm sick of teaching in that way. And so because I'm in a very privileged position here in Brisbane where we are able to do face-to-face teaching, I definitely have kind of gone to a place of, how do we get face-to-face? How do we get outside? How do we connect? What does that mean from a green theatre perspective, or an ecological perspective, or an ethical perspective? So yeah, these are all questions that have really been bubbling up for me recently. And I have no exact answers right now, but I'm going to keep digging, I think. Yeah,
I think it's yes, that's fascinating, because it's the other sort of big topic, isn't it, that's rising up the agenda. There's the way we've coped with pandemic, but there's also the even larger issue around climate change and things that we're having to address too, and how we move forward. And I'm sure that's going to be the subject of a kind of future debates and things around this. But Olayinka, if do you want to address the same sort of question on there from a very different, because it's almost as like you ended your presentation saying the way forward is digital. We can't sort of go backwards, but it's interesting that sort of digitally rich cultures are sort of looking beyond that. What's your feeling around that? You're still muted at the moment.
All right. As an actor, director, the only way I see is the world going forward is technologically. Sincerely, we cannot do anything. Like my conclusion, my paper said, look, there's nothing we can do without thinking about how to go forward technologically. There are many things that are being done in the world now. Theater must key into this, and of course, naturally, use this technology to develop itself. So we can always do plays that I want Tessa to see in Australia, plays that I'm doing here in Ibadan that I want you to see in England, and all that at the same time as I'm putting it on. We tried some experiments, earlier in the year when I think around March, the peak of the problem, we had a play and then we put it on Zoom. And we were expecting a lot of people to see it all over. But then the time difference and all that, we didn't want to use YouTube, whatever, streaming. So it's experiment still going on, but I don't see it, changing. Things have to go in this direction. This is the direction of the future. And so actors, directors must be trained into how to key into this digital space that we are talking about. And of course, from their own perspective as performance space educators, definitely you're already keying into this future. It is the actors who are embodied, the dancers whose act are embodied that needs to learn how to also, key into this future. There's no going back. That's my take.
Thank you. Yes, thank you for your response. We've just got a couple of minutes left, and there's a couple of things still left in the Q&A box, and I just see if we can quickly get to that. We've got a question from Gareth. I don't know if you're like to come onto the mic, Gareth, and ask your question live.
Hello there.
Hello.
Please excuse the squeakings of my 4-year-old in the background if they do suddenly appear. I was just quite interested in some feedback I had from some of my students regarding the captured content and recording of classes, so that those students who had to self-isolate or otherwise were unable to attend a lecture, class or workshop in person, reported a very different experience when viewing it through a fixed camera or even sometimes multiple camera layout. Their relationship was much more that of TV and film. They were passive participant rather than active participants. I've started experimenting very recently in the use of 360 video and 180 video, and students using their phones in an AR environment. Unfortunately, I kind of missed the boat in the depth of it, but it's something I'm looking to explore further. I wondered if anyone on the panel had looked at that in their institutes or had any experience, and what their observations were.
Thank you, Gareth. Who would like to respond to that?
I can take a crack at it. Gareth, it's a really good point. And yes, I think I agree. Yeah, when we returned predominantly back to face-to-face teaching, yeah, we were having to record everything for students who weren't there, or try to do hybrid in terms of having students on Zoom while also having, students in the class, etc. I tried and failed to experiment with 360 videos while we were working on that virtual theatre project. The theatre in question was actually planned to get knocked down at the end of last year, even though it's about 70 years old. We have a bad habit in Brisbane of knocking down our buildings that should be heritage listed. So that was happening. It's not anymore because of a delay to capital works in the institution. But I tried to take the students' work and turn it into 360 videos. Because of time, I never got the workload sorted out, because I really wanted to be able to take their work and then give it back to them, and then give it back to their family and friends and anyone else on social media, to be able to try and experience what they made in 360. But tried to figure it out myself and couldn't pull it off. So when you mentioned 360 video, I thought about that. But I think I saw in your comment as well, you talk about like AR and VR. I know I had some colleagues who were trying to do some cool things with AR stuff on the phones, and I think there was a couple of little experiments in other disciplines in the uni. But because of time, I think everyone similarly you see the potential, and then it hits the reality of everything else you've got to do, as it seems like you did yourself. But yes, in terms of, I completely agree in terms of, yes, the students who weren't able to be in the space felt that disconnect from the content and didn't have the same experience.
To quickly say that I found that interesting, and even though I haven't done anything in this area, but I'll make sure that I bring my media students and my acting students together and do some experiments and see how it goes as well. in this 380 video recording of live events and all. I want to see how it will work. All right.
I think there's a whole issue there, isn't there, around engagement through this medium to prevent that kind of the passive participant as opposed to the active. Peter, would you like to come in there?
Yeah, it's more of a comment than anything. I mean, I've been amazed yesterday and today by the skills of the tutors and educators of actually learning these new programs and having to go in, because we think, also from people saying, our students taught us how to do this, we tried that sort of thing. But I think, you know, it takes us into another realm, a completely different realm of all these different programs and how you use them and whether you've got the signal strength and all the rest of it. We really need a course for tutors, don't we, to actually find out what all these different programs do and perhaps all their possibilities. But I think people have been, what I've gathered is people have been amazing to their adaptability and their investigation of using all these different things that are already made out there for the purposes of scenography, which is extraordinary, I think.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. I'm gonna bring this panel to a close now. I just want to thank Tessa and Olayinka for their presentations and for the discussions. There's a lot more going into the chat now, which we will try and get to the comments. And thank you for putting it. These are all obviously very much ongoing discussions that we hope to come back to.